I've spent 20 years working with broken things, timepieces that stopped decades ago, mechanisms so delicate that one careless touch can ruin them forever. You learn patience in this line of work. You learn to listen to what isn't being said. My name is Charlotte Bennett. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've restored vintage watches, the kind collectors keep in glass cases and insurers treat like small pieces of history. The day my husband asked for a divorce, I was restoring a 1920s pocket watch that hadn't ticked since the Great Depression. It was late afternoon. The workshop smelled faintly of brass polish and machine oil. Sunlight filtered through the high window above my bench, catching the tiny gears spread across the cloth mat in front of me. When you work on something that old, every movement matters. I had just adjusted the balance spring when the door opened behind me. I didn't look up immediately. "Just a minute," I said automatically. "If I rush this part, I'll ruin the Charlotte." The tone made me stop. I set the tweezers down carefully and turned. Daniel stood in the doorway of my workshop. My husband of 20 years. And somehow, in that moment, he looked like a stranger. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. If anything, he looked impatient. "I want a divorce," he said. Just like that. No build-up, no explanation. The words landed with the same casual weight someone might use to ask what was for dinner. I studied his face for a long moment. Then I gently placed the pocket watch on the cloth. "Okay," I said. Daniel blinked, as if that hadn't been the response he expected. He stepped farther into the room, glancing around at the shelves lined with antique timepieces. "I'd like to keep this simple," he said. "Clean. Efficient." I waited. He took a breath, then moved straight to business. "I want the house," he said. "The investment accounts, the art collection, and the watch inventory." He gestured toward the insured cabinets behind me. "You've put enough away over the years that splitting it would be messy. I think it's better if I just take it all." The quiet ticking of the pocket watch filled the room. I didn't interrupt. "You don't react until you understand what's really in front of you." "And Lily?" he added, as if he'd almost forgotten. "I don't want custody." That made my fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the bench. "She's 10, I said. Daniel shrugged. "Exactly. She's old enough to adapt, and honestly, a child would complicate things for me right now." "Complicate what?" "My next phase." He smiled faintly, like a man explaining something perfectly reasonable. "You're the better parent anyway. You're patient. You work from home most days. This is better for her." Outside the workshop window, I could see Lily in the yard. She was practicing cartwheels across the grass, laughing at something only she could see, completely unaware her father was removing her from his future. "You've been planning this," I said. "Not a question." Daniel didn't deny it. Vanessa helped me think things through. That name landed in the room like a dropped screw. Vanessa, his ex-girlfriend from years ago, the one who had reappeared 6 months earlier. "She introduced me to someone," he continued, "a financial consultant, Brandon Hale." I recognized the name. Brandon was one of those social media investment personalities who posted sports cars, rented confidence, and quotes about wealth. "He's helping me see things differently," Daniel said. "Charlotte, you're a good person, but you're stuck in the past." His eyes drifted to the watch on my desk. "You spend your life repairing dead things, old mechanisms, old traditions. And you don't want to live like that anymore," I said quietly. "Exactly." There was relief in his voice now, like he'd been waiting months to say it out loud. "Brandon is building something huge, a cryptocurrency investment platform. Vanessa's involved too." I leaned back against the bench. "And you?" "I'm part of it now." Daniel spread his hands. "So that's the situation. I take the assets. You keep Lily. We both move on." I studied him for a long moment. 20 years of marriage. And the man standing in front of me looked polished on the surface and hollow underneath. "Fine," I said. Daniel blinked again. "Fine? You can have it. The house, the investments, the collection. All of it." Suspicion crept into his expression. "You're not going to fight me?" I shook my head slowly. "Why would I?" He relaxed immediately, a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I knew you'd be reasonable about this." He turned toward the door. "My lawyer will send paperwork in a few days." "Make it faster," I said. He paused. Then he smiled. "See, that's exactly why this will work." A minute later, the door closed behind him. The workshop fell silent again. I sat down at the bench. The pocket watch was still ticking. Perfectly. Despite being nearly a century old, I lifted it carefully and held it to my ear. Steady, precise, honest. Daniel thought he understood value because he could recognize price tags. But I had spent 2 decades learning something else. The difference between what something costs and what it's actually worth. He wanted everything, and I was going to let him have it. The paperwork arrived 3 days later. A thick envelope from a law office downtown, heavy with the quiet finality of legal language. I placed it on my bench beside the pocket watch and opened it slowly. Divorce petitions, asset transfer agreements, property declarations. Daniel had been efficient. Every page laid out exactly how he intended to dismantle 20 years of marriage. The house would transfer fully into his name. The investment accounts, the art collection, my workshop business assets, and the vintage watch inventory stored in the insured cabinets along the north wall. I read the documents twice, then a third time. The numbers alone totaled just under $3.7 million. When I finished, I closed the folder and sat still for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone. The attorney listed for my representation was Margaret Lawson. Her office answered on the second ring. Lawson and Burke. My name is Charlotte Bennett, I said. I need to schedule a consultation. There was a brief pause. Yes, Ms. Bennett. Ms. Lawson can see you tomorrow morning. Margaret's office sat on the third floor of an older building downtown, the kind of place with polished wood railings and floors that creaked softly under your feet. Margaret Lawson herself was in her early 50s, silver threaded through her dark hair, and her eyes had the sharp, alert look of someone who missed very little. She had already reviewed the documents by the time I arrived. When I sat down across from her desk, she tapped the folder with a pen. I'll be honest with you, she said. This is one of the most lopsided divorce proposals I've seen in 25 years of practice. That bad? Your husband wants the house, every investment account, the art collection, your workshop business assets, and the entire watch inventory. She flipped to another page. Estimated value approximately $3.7 million. I know. She studied me. And you're considering agreeing to this? Yes. Margaret leaned back slowly. That concerns me. She slid another document across the desk. I also reviewed the financial records you sent ahead of the meeting. There are several irregularities. What kind? Your husband has been moving money for about 6 months. My stomach didn't tighten. It simply confirmed what I already suspected. Where? Several accounts tied to a private investment venture. She tapped a highlighted section. The name Brandon Hale appears repeatedly. I nodded once. That makes sense. Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. You already knew? Not the details, but I knew he was involved. She pulled another folder from her drawer. These investments are connected to a cryptocurrency platform Mr. Hale is promoting online. How much? Roughly $600,000. I let out a slow breath. And the performance? Margaret gave a thin smile. Based on what I can see, the venture has already lost about 40% of its value. That quickly? These platforms move fast, she said. Sometimes upward, sometimes not. She folded her hands on the desk. Now here's where this gets interesting. I waited. Your husband is demanding exclusive ownership of the marital assets. Yes. That also means he assumes exclusive liability for any debt attached to them. I watched the gears turning behind her eyes. He's taking everything, she continued, but also every tax obligation, loan, investment loss, and pending liability tied to those assets. Exactly. Margaret studied me more carefully now. Most clients come in here furious when their spouse demands everything. You don't seem angry. I'm not. Why? I considered the question for a moment. Then I glanced at the watch on her desk. A small modern quartz model. Functional. Disposable. In my work, I said slowly, some watches look flawless when you first open the case. But once you put pressure on the system, the weaknesses show. Margaret leaned forward. You're letting him apply the pressure. Yes. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she flipped to another section of the paperwork. There's another issue you should understand before making that decision. The watch collection. What about it? These pieces require ongoing authentication and maintenance certification to hold full insured market value. I nodded. I'm aware. She slid a document toward me. Without your signed restoration and service records, the insurance coverage becomes limited and their auction value drops sharply. How much? Margaret checked the page. Roughly 15 to 20% of their current appraised value. Her eyes narrowed. Your husband requested the watches, but not the certification framework that supports their value. No, I said. He never cared how the market actually worked. He only cared what the top-line number looked like. Margaret exhaled slowly. So, if he tries to liquidate quickly, he's going to learn an expensive lesson. Yes. She sat back in her chair. So if we fight this settlement, you'll likely keep most of the assets. Yes. And if you don't fight? He gets exactly what he asked for. She studied me again, her expression shifting slightly. Charlotte, I need to ask you something as your attorney. Are you absolutely certain you understand what you're giving up here? Perfectly. Your house? Yes. Your investments? Yes. Your professional inventory? Yes. Margaret shook her head slowly. I can't decide if you're incredibly reckless or incredibly patient. I smiled faintly. Patient. She reached for a pen. All right, she said. But I'm going to document something very clearly. What's that? That I advised you repeatedly not to accept these terms. That's fair. She began drafting response paperwork. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing asset transfers, legal language, and custody agreements. When we finished, Margaret placed the final document in front of me. Once this is signed, she said, your husband gets exactly what he demanded. That's the plan. She watched me sign. Then she said quietly, you know what worries me? What? People who get everything they want rarely know what to do with it. I stood and shook her hand. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk. My phone buzzed as I reached the corner. A text from Daniel. Brandon says you're being very mature about this. Thanks for not making things difficult. I stared at the message for a moment, then slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Some things are better explained by time, and time was one thing I understood very well. The final hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning. Rain had fallen before sunrise, leaving the streets dark and slick, the city washed into muted shades of gray. I wore a simple navy suit I'd owned for years. Nothing dramatic, nothing expensive. The kind of thing you wear when you want the day to pass without drawing attention to yourself. Lily sat beside me in the car on the way downtown, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had asked me twice that morning if she needed to come. Both times I told her no. Both times she said the same thing. I want to see what happens. There are moments when children say something so calmly that you realize they understand more than anyone wanted them to. By the time we walked into the courthouse, Daniel was already there. So were Vanessa and Brandon Hale. Of course, Brandon came. Men like him never miss an audience. He stood near the courtroom doors in a charcoal coat that probably cost more than it should have, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on Daniel's back, like this was some kind of launch event rather than the formal burial of a marriage. Vanessa stood beside them in a cream-colored dress and heels, too sharp for the weather, scrolling through her phone until she noticed me. She lifted her chin slightly. Not a greeting, not an apology, just acknowledgement. Daniel turned then, and for a second I caught the old version of him in the set of his shoulders, but it vanished almost immediately. He looked polished, smug even, like a man who believed he had finally stepped into the better life he deserved. His gaze dropped to Lily. For one strange second, I thought maybe I would see something soften in his face, some hesitation, some flicker of shame. Instead, he simply said, "You brought her?" Lily's hand tightened around mine. "She wanted to come," I answered. He gave a small shrug as if that was mildly inconvenient, then turned back toward Brandon. That was when something inside me became very still. Not angry, not shattered, still. Margaret arrived a few minutes later carrying a leather folder under one arm. She looked from Daniel to Brandon to Vanessa and then at me. "Well," she murmured, low enough for only me to hear, "they do seem very pleased with themselves." "People usually are," I said, right before consequences catch up. Her mouth twitched, but she didn't smile. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. There is something almost disappointing about the rooms where life changes forever. You expect grandeur, echoes, some cinematic sense of proportion. Instead, it was fluorescent lighting, polished wood, and a flag standing in the corner like a quiet witness that had seen too much. Judge Eleanor Anderson entered precisely on time. She was in her 60s, sharp-faced, composed, and carried herself with the unmistakable air of a woman who had spent decades watching people lie in polite language. She sat, reviewed the file before her, and adjusted her glasses. "This is the matter of Bennett versus Bennett," she said. Her voice was even, dry, and entirely uninterested in anyone's performance. Margaret stood when addressed, confirming representation. Daniel's attorney, a sleek man with a confident voice and expensive cufflinks, did the same. Then the judge began turning pages. At first it was routine. Names, dates, residency, minor child. Then Judge Anderson paused. She looked over the top of her glasses directly at me. "Ms. Bennett," she said, "I want to address the settlement terms with you personally." Margaret rose slightly. "Your Honor, my client has been advised extensively." "I'm sure she has," the judge said. "I'd still like to hear from her." Margaret sat. I stood. The judge glanced at the document again. "You are agreeing to transfer the marital home, all joint investment accounts, all business-related assets associated with your watch restoration practice, the art holdings, and a collection appraised at approximately $2.8 million. Is that your understanding?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you are doing so willingly?" "I am." She looked at me for another moment. "In 33 years on this bench," she said, "I have seen people give away marriages, dignity, retirement, and common sense. I have not often seen someone surrender this much property without contest." Across the aisle, Daniel shifted in his chair. I could feel Brandon watching me, probably waiting for some emotional collapse he could privately label weakness. Judge Anderson continued, "Your counsel has formally noted that she advised against these terms multiple times. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then explain to me why you are proceeding." Daniel's attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, with respect, the parties have agreed to—" The judge lifted one hand. "Sit down." He sat. There was a beat of silence. I could hear the heating system hum in the back of the room, Lily's breathing beside me. Somewhere, a shoe scraped softly across the tile. I kept my voice level. "My husband has made it very clear what he wants," I said. "I don't see a reason to turn that into a public battle." The judge's expression did not change. "And you believe this settlement is fair?" "No," I said. The room shifted slightly at that. Daniel's attorney frowned. Vanessa looked up. Even Brandon straightened. I continued before anyone could interrupt. "But fairness and clarity are not always the same thing. He wants these assets. He believes they will give him the life he wants. I see no reason to stand in his way." It was the truth, just not all of it. The judge held my gaze for several seconds, then looked down at the custody section. "Mr. Bennett," she said. Daniel rose. "You are voluntarily relinquishing all custodial rights and responsibilities regarding your minor daughter, Lily Bennett. Is that correct?" His voice came easy. "Yes, Your Honor. Charlotte is better suited to provide stability." That word landed wrong. Stability. As if fatherhood were some scheduling inconvenience, and not a living bond with the child sitting 10 feet away. Judge Anderson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You understand," she said, "that this is not a temporary arrangement. You are waiving primary custody, legal decision-making authority, and presumptive visitation. Future access to the child will be subject to the custodial parent's consent or further court review, if contested. Do you understand that?" "I understand." Lily's fingers curled around mine harder. I squeezed back gently. The judge turned to her for the briefest moment, and whatever she saw in Lily's face seemed to settle something inside her. Then she signed. Not dramatically. Not with hesitation. Just a series of clean strokes across the page. "Very well," she said. "The settlement is approved as written. Mr. Bennett will receive the specified assets and associated liabilities. Ms. Bennett will receive sole legal and physical custody of the minor child. This marriage is dissolved." That was it. 20 years reduced to a few signatures in under half an hour. The lawyers began gathering papers. Chairs shifted, pens clicked closed. Life, apparently, could be dismantled with less noise than most people expected. Daniel smiled before we even left the room. In the hallway, Brandon clapped him once on the shoulder. Vanessa leaned in and whispered something that made Daniel laugh under his breath. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. It was the sound that mattered. The loose, careless sound of someone already spending money he hadn't yet touched. Margaret stepped closer to me while Lily stood at my side. "Last chance," she said quietly. "I can still file emergency objections before the transfer completes." I shook my head. "No." She searched my face again. "You're very calm." "I have to be." "That's not what I meant." I glanced toward the far end of the hallway. Daniel was standing with Brandon now, looking pleased, almost bright. Vanessa had her phone out, angling it for a photo in the soft courthouse light. Daniel leaned toward her automatically, already rehearsing the version of this story he would tell the world. The brave choice. The bold new beginning. The future. "No," I said softly. "It's already in motion." Margaret let out a breath and handed me one of her business cards. "When things go wrong—" "If," I corrected mildly. Her eyes narrowed. "When things go wrong," she repeated, "call me." Lily and I walked toward the elevator. As we waited, Daniel approached us alone. For a second, I thought perhaps he had come for Lily. Maybe to say something gentle. Maybe to offer a promise he had no idea how to keep. Instead, he looked at me. "I appreciate you not making this ugly," he said. The elevator doors remained shut. Metal reflected all of us back in fragments. "You're welcome," I answered. He hesitated, then glanced down at Lily. "Be good for your mother, okay?" Lily said nothing. Not because she was rude, because she had already learned silence could carry more truth than language. Daniel looked uncomfortable for perhaps half a second. Then he cleared his throat and stepped back as the elevator arrived. The doors opened. Lily and I stepped inside. As they slid closed, I caught one last glimpse of him in the hallway, standing beside the woman who carried his past back into his life and the man who sold futures and polished lies. When we reached the ground floor, Lily looked up at me and asked very quietly, "Is it really done?" "Yes," I said. She was silent as we walked to the car. I expected tears, questions, some kind of collapse delayed by courage. Instead, once we were buckled in and the doors were shut, she stared through the windshield and said, "He didn't even ask if I was okay." The ache of that moved through me slowly, like a crack running under glass. No, I said, he didn't. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already suspected. Then she turned toward the window for the rest of the drive. That evening, right on schedule, Daniel posted a photograph. Vanessa sent it to someone who sent it to someone, and by dinner time, half the town had probably seen it. Daniel and Brandon with raised champagne glasses. Vanessa beside them, smiling like she had helped engineer the impossible. The caption read, "New beginnings. Sometimes you have to leave the past behind to step fully into your future. Grateful for what's ahead." The comments came fast. "So proud of you. You chose yourself. This takes courage. Big things coming." I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then turned the phone face down on the counter. Lily was in the living room, curled up under a blanket, waiting for the pizza we had ordered on the way home. The movie she picked was already paused at the opening credits. I sat beside her. She leaned against me without a word. We ate on the couch, watched the movie. At some point, her breathing deepened and her head slipped against my shoulder. When the credits rolled, I carried her upstairs, tucked her in, and stood by the doorway for a long time, watching her sleep. Then I went back down to my workshop. The pocket watch from the day Daniel left was still there on the bench, still ticking. I picked it up and held it to my ear in the dark. Steady, consistent, patient. Daniel had left the courtroom smiling. He thought he had won. Maybe on paper he had. I set the watch gently back on the cloth mat and turned off the light. Time would handle the rest. 2 weeks after the divorce, life had settled into something quieter. Not peaceful exactly, but stable. Lily and I moved out of the house within days of the hearing. Daniel had wanted the place immediately, eager to turn it into whatever version of success Brandon had promised him. I didn't argue. Instead, I signed a short-term lease on a small house near the lake at the edge of town. It wasn't grand, but it had a garage big enough for a workbench and a narrow dock that stretched 20 feet into the water. Lily liked feeding the ducks before school. Every morning, she stood at the end of the dock, tossing bits of bread, while the lake mist hovered low over the surface like a quiet secret. Children adapt faster than adults think, but they notice everything. One morning, while we were eating breakfast, Lily looked up from her cereal and asked, "Why hasn't Dad called?" I set my coffee down slowly. Sometimes people need time to figure out their new life. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. Still, she didn't press. Instead, she finished her cereal, grabbed her backpack, and asked if we could keep working on the watch I had shown her the night before. "After school," I said. She smiled. That smile was one of the reasons I knew I had made the right decision. Because if I had fought Daniel in court, Lily would have spent months sitting in waiting rooms, while adults argued over things that had nothing to do with her. This way, the storm had passed quickly, or so it seemed. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in the garage workshop adjusting the balance wheel on an old Hamilton pocket watch when my phone vibrated across the table. Unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it. But something made me answer. "Charlotte Bennett speaking." "Ms. Bennett?" The woman on the other end sounded professional, slightly cautious. "Yes, my name is Christy O'Brien. I'm calling from Western Authentication Services regarding the Richmond watch collection." I leaned back slightly. "What about it?" There was a brief pause. "Your ex-husband contacted our office earlier this week requesting authentication and insurance verification for several pieces." "Which ones?" She shuffled papers. "A 1910 Patek Philippe, an 1885 Vacheron Constantin, and 3 additional vintage chronographs. Those were some of the most valuable pieces in the collection." "What does he want to do with them?" I asked. "He intends to sell them immediately." Of course he did. People who believe they've discovered fast money rarely have patience for slow assets. "There's just one complication," Christy continued. "I'm aware," I said. Another pause. "Then you understand that these pieces require continuous maintenance certification." "Yes. Without the original restorer's authentication and service documentation, we cannot verify their mechanical integrity or insure them for auction." "I know. Your ex-husband insisted we proceed anyway," she said. "But before explaining the valuation consequences to him, we wanted to confirm whether you intended to provide the certification records." I looked down at the Hamilton watch on my bench. Its balance wheel rotated smoothly under the magnifying lens. "What happens if I don't?" I asked. Christy cleared her throat. "Without the certification chain, collectors consider the mechanical history incomplete." "And the value?" "Approximately 15 to 20% of the appraised estimate." That meant a watch worth $200,000 might sell for 30, maybe 40, if someone was feeling generous. "I see," I said. "So, will you be providing the documentation?" I removed the loop from my eye. "No." Her voice softened slightly. "I suspected that might be your answer." "He owns those watches now," I said. "What he does with them is his business." "Understood." We hung up. Daniel called an hour later. I didn't answer. 5 minutes later, he called again. Then again. By evening, my phone showed 4 missed calls from his number. Then a text arrived. We need to talk about the collection. This is important. Call me back. I placed the phone face down on the table and continued working. Another message arrived 20 minutes later. Charlotte, this is ridiculous. These watches need your certification. I read it, then opened the settings menu and blocked his number. The next call came the following morning. This time the name on the screen read, Margaret Lawson. Good morning, I said. Morning, she replied. I just got off the phone with your ex-husband's attorney. That didn't take long. No, she said dryly. Apparently there's an issue with the watch collection. Not my issue. He's threatening to claim fraud, says you failed to disclose the certification requirements. I almost laughed. Every requirement is listed in the restoration records. I know, I already told his lawyer that. She paused. Your ex-husband should have read the documentation before demanding ownership. People rarely read the fine print when they think they're winning. Margaret hummed thoughtfully. There's something else. What? You know that crypto platform Brandon Hale has been promoting? Yes. It collapsed yesterday. I leaned back in the chair. That was quick. Federal investigators announced a securities fraud probe this morning. She flipped a page. According to the filings, the platform had been fabricating investor returns. How much damage? Rough estimate so far, $2 million. And Brandon? Apparently cooperating with investigators. To reduce his own exposure, no doubt. And Daniel? Margaret exhaled. Based on the investment transfers in your records, he's heavily involved. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not out of shock, out of recognition. When you open a watch case and see corrosion spreading through the gears, you already know what will happen once the mechanism starts moving. Charlotte, Margaret said, I'm here. You sound very calm about this. I told you, I replied quietly. Pressure reveals the truth. She chuckled softly. You're a frighteningly patient woman. No, I said. Just experienced. That weekend, Lily and I went to the hardware store. We needed wood panels for a small workbench she wanted to build beside mine in the garage. She walked ahead of me through the aisle, carrying a tape measure, carefully reading the numbers like it was some kind of secret code. Halfway to the register, I noticed someone standing near the paint counter. Amber, one of Vanessa's closest friends. She saw me at the same moment. For a split second, it looked like she might walk over. Then she hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward Lily, then back to me. Finally, she pulled out her phone and pretended to read something very carefully. Lily tugged my sleeve. That's one of Dad's friends, she whispered. I know. She looked scared. I glanced back toward Amber. She was still pretending to text, but her shoulders had stiffened. Yes, I said quietly. She does. We paid for the wood and walked out into the parking lot. Halfway home, Lily said something unexpected. Dad's not happy, is he? I kept my eyes on the road. Why do you think that? He used to post online all the time. People at school mentioned it. Now he hasn't posted anything in weeks. Smart kid. Sometimes, I said, people go through changes they didn't expect. Is he going to lose all the money? I looked over. Where did you hear that? Parents talk, kids hear things. Small towns work like that. Everyone's secrets eventually leak into the open air. I think he's going to learn something, I said. What? That depends on him. She thought about that quietly. Then she looked out the window and said softly, I'm glad I stayed with you. The words hit harder than anything Daniel had done. Me too, kid, I said. Me too. That night, another message arrived from an unfamiliar number. We need to talk about what you did. Amber. I recognized the tone immediately. I deleted the message without replying. The situation had already started moving. All I had to do now was wait. 6 weeks after the divorce, Margaret called again. It was early Saturday morning. Lily and I had just come back from the dock where she had been practicing casting a fishing line into the still water. My phone buzzed on the workbench. Margaret's name flashed on the screen. That sounds ominous, I said when I answered. You might want to sit down, she replied. I'm already sitting. Good. There was a brief pause. I'm sending you a news article. A moment later, the notification appeared. I opened the link. The headline was blunt. Local financial influencer. Under federal investigation for securities fraud. Below it was a photograph of Brandon Hale. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. But the article underneath told a very different story. The investigation had uncovered a network of fraudulent cryptocurrency investment accounts, fake returns, fabricated profit statements, money from new investors used to pay earlier participants, a classic collapse disguised as innovation. Nearly 40 investors had already reported losses. Estimated damage, $2 million. And halfway down the article was Daniel's name, listed as one of the largest individual investors. I leaned back in my chair. Well, I said quietly, that escalated quickly. Margaret exhaled through the phone. That's not the worst part. There's more? According to the filings, Daniel wasn't just investing, he was encouraging others to join. I rubbed my forehead slowly. So he recruited people. Yes. That makes him potentially liable for civil damages. How much? Too early to say, she replied. But if multiple investors claim he misrepresented the platform, she let the sentence hang unfinished. I see. Charlotte, she continued, his financial exposure could be enormous. I stared out the garage window toward the lake. The morning sunlight had started burning away the mist. Is the house still in his name? Yes. Then the bank will come for that first. Already happening, she said. Apparently, Daniel took out a second mortgage against the property right after the divorce finalized. Of course he did. Fast money requires fast leverage. And the watch collection, she added. I almost smiled. What about it? He tried to sell 3 pieces through a private broker last week. And? The broker contacted authentication services. That must have gone well. Margaret laughed quietly. The watches are currently valued at about 20% of their previous appraisal. Collectors don't like incomplete mechanical histories. No, she agreed. They don't. She paused before finishing. You know he's been trying to reach you. I know. Are you going to call him back? No. That's harsh. No, I said. It's accurate. Later that afternoon, Lily and I drove into town for groceries. The parking lot outside the market was unusually crowded. As we walked toward the entrance, I noticed 2 women standing near the carts, whispering to each other. One of them glanced at me, then quickly looked away. News travels fast in small communities. Inside the store, Lily grabbed a basket and started picking out vegetables with careful attention. Halfway through the produce aisle, she stopped suddenly. That's another one of Dad's friends, she whispered. I followed her gaze. Amber stood at the far end of the aisle, staring at a stack of apples like they might explain something important. She noticed us almost immediately. For a moment, she looked like she might approach. Instead, she turned sharply and pushed her cart toward another aisle. Lily watched her go. She looks different. How? She used to look confident. I glanced toward the corner where Amber had disappeared. Now she looked like someone who had suddenly realized the ground beneath her feet wasn't stable. Sometimes people look different when things change, I said. Lily thought about that. Then she said something that made me smile. Good. 3 days later, the next piece of news arrived. This time Margaret didn't call. She simply forwarded another article. The headline read, Investigation expands as investors file civil suits. Brandon Hale had begun cooperating with federal investigators. In exchange for leniency, he was providing documentation of everyone involved in promoting the platform, including Daniel and Vanessa. Several investors had already filed lawsuits claiming they had been persuaded to invest by Daniel personally. Total claimed damages were approaching $1.5 million. I set the phone down slowly. Across the garage, Lily sat at the small workbench we had built together, carefully polishing the brass casing of a vintage Omega watch. Her hands moved with surprising steadiness. You're quiet, she said without looking up. Just reading something. About Dad? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked over and leaned beside her workbench. Yes. Is he in trouble? He made some choices that didn't work out. Like when you wind a watch too tight? I blinked. You remember that? You told me last week. She kept polishing the watch case. If you wind it too tight, the spring breaks. Sometimes, I said. Sometimes the gears strip first. She nodded thoughtfully. Do you think he knows that yet? I think he's about to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that cut deeper than anything else. Do you think he misses me? The words settled heavily in the air between us. I crouched beside her chair. I think your father is dealing with a lot right now. That's not what I asked. No, it wasn't. I think, I said slowly, that one day he'll realize what he walked away from. Will you let him see me if he asks? I looked at her carefully. If your father gets his life together and truly wants to be part of yours again, I won't stand in the way. But he has to prove something first. What? That he's ready. Ready for what? To be your father. She nodded once. Then she returned to the Omega watch. Good, she said. I'm busy anyway. That evening, after Lily went upstairs, I sat alone on the dock watching the sun disappear across the water. The lake turned gold and amber as the light faded. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Another unknown number. I already knew who it was. I let it ring. Then go to voicemail. A few seconds later, a text arrived. Charlotte, please, I need to talk to you. I stared at the message for a long time, then locked the phone and set it beside me. Daniel had wanted everything. The house. The money. The watches. The future Brandon promised. And the court had given him exactly that. Everything. Now all he had to do was live with it.